So this is going to be a space where we can think very quickly in terms of Roman Catholic marriage and how it's drawn inspiration from different cultures over the centuries. There have been many attempts at defining marriage. So much of this has been culturally determined. And the Roman Catholic Church draws wisdom from different secular traditions. So whether it's from Roman tradition, and when I say Roman, I'm not yet referring to the Roman Catholic Church, but truly what was practiced in the Roman Empire. How did governments define legal unions as such? We're also going to think through some Greek values, how Greek customs would have impacted marriage, as well as some other cultures to be mentioned later on. Now, within Roman tradition, a legal marriage is largely serving a purpose of protecting property. In other words, marriage allows the government to have a very clear understanding of inheritance, right? Who is going to receive certain assets in what order. And so for the Roman Empire, it doesn't legally make sense for certain groups, such as slaves, to have legal marriages, right? So if there's no property to pass on, of course, people are going to fall in love and make commitments, but it would have been more of a marriage of wills rather than something that is institutionally recognized by the government. So a civil union from the Roman standards is really only for Roman citizens, right? Someone who has that standing in society. On top of that, Roman tradition will dictate that a marriage is binding when two fathers have generated a contract and then agreed that their children are going to be together. And so it would stipulate a starting date for their marriage, etc., and it would have been signed. So having this understanding of marriage as a contract is going to eventually infiltrate and be Christianized and repackaged in Catholic tradition. And I'll get to that also in a moment. Now, for the church, right, if we're thinking about Jesus's contemporaries, they would be drawing upon perhaps synagogue life or synagogue liturgies. The New Testament does give us pictures of weddings, but we're mostly seeing that in terms of a feast or a celebration. Not so much a very systematized way of how a religious institution would grant its blessing. We don't yet have these formal church buildings or sanctuaries where marriages would take place in any sense that Christianity would recognize it. And we definitely don't yet have a tradition of priests or bishops presiding over those occasions. So for many years, it's almost going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge of how couples consider their relationship to be official. And if something is uniquely Christian, it's really the couple's decision as a twosome to say, you know what, I want to grow in faith with you. I want to have a relationship with Christ with you. That would have had any sort of like recognizably Christian layer to what government standards provided. In due time, as the church sharpens and hones the boundaries of marriage, the church is going to be a little more romantic than the Roman Empire. So instead of a contract between two dads, the contract is still a part of the ceremony, but it's between two consenting adults, right? So you're not going to be married against your will. You have to enter into the relationship willingly. Now, one of the things we had mentioned through our conversations on church power, on the power of clergy and ordination, part of the rise of Western Christianity, what becomes Roman Christianity, and part of the rise of the papacy is in large part due to the fact that the Roman Empire is eventually going to crumble and dismantle and lose its political influence. So, where there's somewhat of a leadership void, bishops are going to rise to the occasion and fill those gaps and provide that stability in society where politicians don't seem to give that same sense of security for the communities. Now, just as political influence is going to kind of ebb and flow, eventually the governmental principalities will become strong once again. Over a few centuries, you'll see a rise in nobility, of princes, feudal landlord systems are going to take over. And it's going to get to this point where even government officials are going to think, I have enough sway to dictate who is a parish priest, right? I get to appoint who's the bishop of this diocese. So it's really at this moment in history where all of a sudden, and we're kind of getting into year 600 or so 600 years after Jesus is walked on this planet and then resurrected, bishops are going to take measures to reassert their authority once again. So up until this point where marriage had been somewhat more a family, private affair, somewhat more organic, we're going to begin to see the first institutionalized attempts for the Roman Catholic Church to monitor marriages. Oh, you princes, you want to say that you're in charge? Well, guess what? You can't even have the basic family unit unless we say so. You can't even have the ultimate building block of society unless the church is involved. So, out of almost a sense of weakness or insecurity, bishops are going to rise up and insist, in fact, mandate that legal marriages must take place in the church context. Specifically, a lot of weddings are taking place on the steps, right, at the entrance of the church. Only later in history are weddings going to sort of creep inside the church walls. And for anyone who's interested in PR, kind of what is that public messaging? What is that communicating? It's a very bold statement showing the whole town square, look how we're involved, right? It's a very grand visual display of power and authority of who brings people together, and that would be the church. Now, even though the church is getting involved, it's still a process for several more centuries before the Roman Catholic Church officially names marriage as a sacrament. So marriage is certainly a recognized relationship status that is an institutional status, but it's not yet elevated to the role of a sacramental lifestyle. A lot of this goes back to, ultimately Christians valuing celibacy over married life, that there's still a harboring of mistrust of, anything that has to do with physical, those types of relationships, a mistrust of sexuality, senses of that the physical body is a source of shame, a site of sin, and that marriage still has a bit of a stigma that it's an extra layer or an extra obstacle in someone's preparation for the next life, for the kingdom of God. Now, on that level of the physical aspect of marriage, because of course the church is going to have very clear opinions on when certain levels of the relationship are appropriate or approved or sanctioned by God. And another component of the Roman Empire losing its influence is in part due to Germanic invasions, that this tribal warfare is going to start to spread their definitions of marriage, spread their standards of society, and the church is going to pick up on those strands as well. Now, within Germanic custom, it's no longer about a contract that Roman custom would say. Instead, what defines a legal marriage has to do with consummation, right? Is that first intimate moment between a couple where they consummate it through intercourse. So in a peculiar way, there is no premarital sex for Germanic custom because your first time is what marries you, right? That would be how you got married. And so even if a couple is betrothed to one another, engaged to one another, if someone leaves the relationship and unites with someone else, then that is what is binding, not the engagement, not the promise. Now, why these technicalities matter and why they even matter today is because the Roman Catholic Church is going to adapt to some of this. Now, like I said, with Roman tradition, it's now a contract between the two engaged individuals, not the dads. But that's going to be combined with this understanding that consummation is what completes the marriage rite, the marriage ritual. And why that moment matters is that will then kind of have a reverse effect on when a couple is allowed to have an annulment, when a couple is allowed to, in effect, back out of the deal. So this would happen throughout Roman Catholic history. Couples would go through some sort of religious ceremony, religious service. But if they could argue or prove that it wasn't consummated, then it was perfectly scriptural, reasonable, theological to say the marriage was the marriage was never fully, like the integrity of the marriage was never fully initiated in the first place. So an annulment is not a breaking of a marriage, it's a claim that the marriage never fully began. And that type of criteria, that standard continues on today, actually. What's also kind of provocative about the ways in which the Roman Catholic Church incorporates consummation as a meaningful part of the marriage act is that when marriage eventually rises to the level of a sacrament, it starts to somewhat suggest or insinuate that that type of marital activity is sacramental, at least the first time, right? That type of physical union that's a gift from God is a ritual, right? It is a church ceremony between the relationship of the two people. So as the church is kind of working through these parameters, we have really an interesting precedent, a precedent that the church is more than willing to find wisdom in non-Christian sources, right? The church is willing to listen and respond and adapt and nuance certain kind of ingredients, so to speak, that are offered outside of the church context and then reappropriated in a Jesus-y way. So is that an invitation for Christians to look to other cultures and find kind of sources of God's fingerprints and grace through other communities or traditions? So anyway, so kind of that cherry on the top of the church trying to display and reassert its sense of eminence is really sealed in year 800 when the Pope is going to do an even grander display of power by declaring Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. So not only does the church make families, but the Pope makes emperors. It's not these governments who make the church, it's the church who makes the governments. And what is more authoritative than declaring who is sovereign over the realm? So even with this milestone, this turning point with Charlemagne, it's still going to be a few more hundred years before marriage is considered an official sacrament. Eventually, we'll get to the Second Lateran Council after year 1100. So an entire millennium has passed. And in this process, the Roman Catholic Church will codify, they're going to compose the literature, the language with the official papal seal of approval that marriage is a sacrament, right? That this is one of the holiest institutions that God works through, that God dispenses grace through, is through that relationship. Interestingly, marriage is elevated to the level of sacrament pretty much at the same time that marriage is now no longer appropriate or officially allowed for clergy. So marriage used to be something clergy could participate in, and then it's no longer considered quote unquote good enough for the priesthood. But the moment it's no longer good enough for the priests is when it gets elevated to the level of sacrament. So it's something that eventually Protestants in the Reformation period are going to pick at. It's something that the Patriarch of Constantinople in Orthodox traditions are going to kind of note that transition. And yet it's also like where we are, that our 7 sacraments are not given all at once in human history, that they have been acquired over time, that we've already learned in class that confirmation becomes a sacrament later in Christian history, and now marriage is a sacrament even later in Christian history. So sometimes I do wonder if one day Jesus will send another revelation, if the Pope will identify another sacrament, or could there even be 20 more sacraments and we just don't know them yet. But what's kind of fun is the Holy Spirit doesn't seem to set everything in stone. It keeps evolving. God keeps speaking to the times and blessing us in new and surprising ways. So in class, after we quickly went through this bit of history, we continued on with our conversations from the vantage point, from the point that we want to affirm marriage as a sacrament and what that means and looks like for Christians today. But for the purposes of this video, I'll end here.